Bionic Commando grappled its way onto your NES back in 1988. Developed and published by Capcom, Bionic Commando is a port of the arcade game of the same name, but that's generally where any similarities end. The original arcade game was, at its core, the same action platform game we'd end up seeing on the NES, with the main gimmick being a grapple arm that your character could use to navigate the stage with, rather than just simply jumping around like just about every other platform-style game at the time. It was a fun and unique way to traverse stages, but unfortunately, besides that one neat gimmick, the arcade version of Bionic Commando never really caught fire with people. Thankfully though, Capcom decided to do something completely different with the NES version of the game and made it into a direct sequel to Commando, the insanely popular overhead shooter that Capcom had already released into arcades and onto the NES a couple of years prior. The NES version of Bionic Commando would end up taking some of the top-down stages of Commando and combine it with the grappling mechanics and platforming of the arcade version of Bionic Commando, creating an open-ended action platform game that was incredibly unique for the time. But did unique translate into fun? Or was this Commando grappling onto thin air? Well, slap on your favorite hook grapple arm thing, because we're about to see if Bionic Commando is worth reaching for. Start up the game and you'll get a story that would get any Bionic Commando's blood boiling. Essentially, a bunch of top-secret plans were created by some sort of old evil empire called Bads, and has now been discovered by the current evil empire with their General Kilt, ready to complete the plans himself. The Federation forces that you fight for are, not too surprisingly, none too happy about that, and have sent their best commando, Super Joe, to find their secret plans, but of course they've lost contact with him in the process. Now it's up to you, the player, to find Super Joe and stop General Kilt from doing whatever it is he's doing. And if you're wondering where the tie-in with the original Commando game comes in, well, you just missed it. Turns out that Super Joe was actually the character you played as in that game, which is a fun answer to a trivia question that no one will ever ask you. From that point, the story cycles back to the start screen, which means the game's telling you to just go ahead and press the start button and stop wasting everyone's time with this story stuff. Once you're done getting hyped up for some hardcore Commando action, you'll get a brief introduction through your radio about what the hell you're even here to do, and then be placed in front of one of the more confusing map screens you could probably ever imagine for a game of this type. Instead of the mostly useless progression maps of other games, or even the choose-your-own-path style maps like Mario 3, Bionic Commando presents you with a bunch of boxes with numbers in them, connected via lines. As a kid, this was probably the first thing about Bionic Commando that genuinely perplexed me, and just makes zero sense at all. None of the numbers are in any sort of numerical order, as they're just kind of laid out all over the map, seemingly at random, with lines going through them that aren't even connecting in any semblance of order. You can tell your helicopter to navigate to any level connected by a line, but even when you get to a level, the game doesn't force you to enter it. Instead, you can choose to start the level or simply fly to another level. And if you happen to run into one of the enemy trucks as you're flying between levels, you'll get tossed into a Commando-like top-down shooting level for a minute, and then be sent back to the map screen once you make it to the end. For a first-time player, this isn't exactly intuitive, but even if you are as confused as I was as a kid looking at this hot mess of a map screen, just go ahead and navigate to the first actual stage you can fly to and get down on the ground to start your hunt for Super Joe. Finally get into a stage and you're met with a more familiar action platformer, with your character being able to run and shoot around the screen like the game you probably thought you were getting when you looked at the back of the box. That is, until you get to the first barrel that's in your way and come to a dead stop. Yes, it appears that even though you're some sort of amazing super commando, no one actually trained you on how to jump. Instead, it's apparently easier to use your experimental grapple arm to grab onto ledges to swing yourself around small objects and pull yourself up to ledges above. And if you're new to the game, then getting used to moving through a level using this thing is probably going to be more challenging than any actual enemy you come up against. Shooting straight up to climb to a higher ledge is simple enough. It's just when you have to use it to swing across gaps or to other platforms is when it can get a bit awkward. And until you master it, then get ready to scream more than a few death threats at your TV because your grapple arm didn't land you where you thought it would, or pulled you directly up into an enemy's ass. Thankfully though, as awkward as it can be at first, the grapple arm can be mastered. And once you do, you'll be swinging around levels like some sort of ninja commando. It's incredibly rewarding being able to swing up and around enemies or across pits of spikes using this thing, and thankfully it never gets old. If you can get used to swinging your way around levels, then the rest of the gameplay should be fairly standard to anyone that's played a shooter on the NES, though it's not always as simple as just shoot your way to the end of the stage, fight a boss, and then rinse and repeat until the credits. No, Bionic Commando can be a bit more obtuse in how you progress through the game. While you definitely do have stages where you can just mow through enemies, make it to the boss, and move on, others require certain items to make it through. For instance, if you navigate to the stage numbered 4, which is actually the second level of the game, told you this would get confusing, you'll find yourself in a cave that's too dark to see anything. To make it through this section, you'll need a flare that you can find in the stage numbered 13. And just how would you ever know this? Well, as you progress through each level, you'll come across transmission rooms that you can use to get valuable info from your commando buddies in the field. And when I say valuable, I mean you would literally have no idea what to do in this game if you miss some of these. Obviously, the flare is easy enough to figure out on your own, but later in the game you'll get directions to secret tunnels you'd never even be able to see, or where particular weapons are that are required to beat a level, along with even being able to hack enemy transmissions to find out where certain objectives are that you'd never know otherwise. And it's also worth noting that some of these rooms can be easily missed as well due to the maze-like design of some levels. So if you miss just one of these, then be prepared to hit several brick walls throughout the course of the game. This goes back to why the map screen lets you fly to any stage in any order, as you'll probably be backtracking more than a few times just to figure out where to go next. Thankfully, once you've figured out what the game is wanting you to do and how to go about doing it, the rest of Bionic Commando settles into a fun, challenging action platformer. Every stage is almost completely unique from the last, with almost all of them focusing on making you use your bionic arm to navigate past new and ever more difficult obstacles. Just when you think you've got things down and are feeling pretty confident with swinging around the levels, the game tosses in a whole new section of spikes and bottomless pits to punch you right in the gut. Sadly though, the challenge doesn't really extend to the game's enemies and bosses, as they're all mostly fodder for you to shoot your way through, and really only become a nuisance when they finally show up in numbers. Most just kinda stand around and shoot at nothing until you decide to put them out of their misery, while other more mobile enemies do the whole run around aimlessly and hope that the player's dumb enough to eventually run into them. The bosses that occupy the end of each stage are generally even less of a threat than the standard enemies, as it's usually easier just to blow past them entirely and destroy the reactor at the end of the stage rather than try and beat them as well, especially when some are just content to stand completely still, swinging their batons in the air like some sort of kid that's had way too much sugar. And even when the game tosses in a larger boss at you, defeating them is usually just a matter of finding a spot where they can't touch you and unloading your gun into them. I think it's safe to say that if you're looking for any sort of quality enemy AI, then Bionic Commando isn't going to be the game for you. Still though, the challenge of making it through the stages with your grapple arm is by far and away where the difficulty in Bionic Commando shines, and it definitely delivers in spades in that department. Playing Bionic Commando throughout the years has certainly given me a greater appreciation for a game that I quickly dismissed as a bunch of bullshit when I was younger. As a kid, the concept of how you were supposed to progress through this game completely flew over my head, especially since the video store decided not to include any instructions at all with the game that I rented. So I spent about 4 or 5 hours wandering through the game aimlessly with only a slight grasp on what I was even doing. It ended up being one of those rentals that I kinda regretted and took back to the video store asking myself why I ruined a perfectly good weekend on this when I could have just rented Mario 2 for the 14th time. Thankfully though, I continued to stick with Bionic Commando over the years, mostly just because I was frustrated with myself because I didn't understand it. And after a few friends and gaming magazines pushed me in the right direction, I was soon having a blast grappling my way through each stage. And besides getting used to the whole grappling thing, which honestly is a fairly large hurdle for anyone that's never played this, there's still a really great game here for anyone to enjoy if you're patient with it, especially with the aid of numerous walkthrough videos and guides littered across the internet for it. And if you already tried it in the past and were put off with it like I was, then maybe give it another go. I guarantee if you stick with it, this is one game that you'll be grappling onto time and time again.